Hey fellow players, it's me, Mario. Today we're still going to talk a bit about something that can be called practical and not too much about theory crafting, which is be the minority. Why fighting? So be the minority, by that I mean by following a path the other players are not following. So zagging while the other ones are zigging or something like that. So there are a few advantages, so many that I chose to use whole two slides to explain them. So be alone in a strategy. That's an advantage by itself, right? So nobody is going to steal your assets or the ones that you want. You're pretty sure you can get them for cheap most of the time, and you're not fighting and bickering against the other guys that are going to do something different. Of course, this works when you're in 3 players or 4 players. This is what I'm focusing on today. In 2 players, of course, there's not really be the minority. You're just be somebody else. But in 3 or 4 players, it's really relevant, and sometimes even in 5 players, even though I don't play too many 5 players game that are heavy Euros. So it's basically Terra Mystica every now and then, I think. But yeah, being alone is an advantage by itself. But on top of that, you can be opportunistic, which means that if there is a very good assets for everybody, and you know the other players are not going to take the ones that you want, you can go for it. You don't have to just focus on your own path. If you were able to carve for yourself a lane, a free lane, you can still take actions that are useful for the other players and only after take what's good for you. This is why being alone in a strategy can be really good. It's not just getting the assets you want for cheap, but the fact that you can take from the other guys what they want and that can still be beneficial to you while you're still following your main path. It's pretty good, I would say. And then keeps your options open. You don't have to go for your path head down and just, do that all the time. You can also think about pivoting at some point. You can do something else if your main path doesn't seem to be good enough. But the good thing is you set yourself up for a good opener. So you probably are building a decent engine and you can still keep your option somewhat open. It's not as easy in every game, and I know that I'm talking in general. I promise that I come with some examples in the next chapter. So you're not going to be a target in the early game. This is also very important. Everybody else is fighting for something. Let's say, I think that a very good example here will be Agricola and the fight to be the first one to grow. So if you can eschew that fight and do something else, which normally is going for like a clay or a stone room early on, or just go for a lot of sheep and a good way to feed, then you're not a target in the early game. Like the other players are not going to take what you need. They are going to fight for, in this case, wood and reed, while you're doing something else entirely. Of course, then you probably need to pivot. We're going to see about that soon enough. But you're not a target. So the other players are not going to target you. They're not going to say how this guy is the one we should fight against because they are too busy fighting themselves. So that's pretty important for you. Then timing isn't a concern. We've seen that in the previous point, but this is just focusing on the timing. So uh, we're going to talk about it in another video that is going to come out, but which is about contested actions. But basically, normally in any game, you should focus on contested action first, and then you can take whatever else is left. Some games have just a lot of contested actions, so it's really interesting to navigate through around. But if you're following a strategic path and you know nobody else is going to take that kind of actions, that's pretty good for you. It means that you can, again, take opportunistically something else that the other players might want, like let's say in Terra Mystica, the 7 coin action or something like that. Uh, and you can do that first because the most important thing to you, which might be, I don't know, the bridge, again in Terra Mystica, will not be contested because nobody else find it interesting enough at that point of the game, while for you, it's very good. but you don't need to, plan for it too much because it's going to come naturally to you. So timing isn't an issue. And again, you can still pivot later on. As we're going to see, like in Agricola, you need to grow at some point. So it's not that you don't need to do anything about it. It's just that avoiding the fight in the first part of the game makes it so that you can build a good engine early on. And after that, you can like squeeze that engine while still doing what the other players are doing. Something that you guys playing Great Western Trail might be familiar with is going for early station master tiles. I'm pretty well known because I'm not too much in favor of early station master tiles. I think people fight for them too much most of the time. But if you're playing against good opponents and they are not prioritizing Station Master Tile too much because they're fighting for heads and for buildings, which is what I think you should do in most games of Great Master Trail anyway, you can actually get a good millage out of the early Station Master Tiles you can get. Because you can get them and then you can still pivot to something else. I mean, you're just going to leave down the heads that you took to gain probably some engineer's head most of the time to gain these station master tiles, and after that you can be a cowboy, you can even be a builder. You probably won't be a full-on builder, but you can still be a builder. So if you focused on something early on, it doesn't mean you have to follow it through the whole game. It means that you eschewed the fight in the early part of the game because you went for something else, but at some point you can still pivot to something that might be a like tier 1 strategy and follow it through, and you have your bases covered because you took some weird line in the beginning of the game that um, should be able to work because you weren't fighting for something else. Let's talk about the disadvantages though. So, following a tier 3 strategy basically means that if your strategic path is very bad, it doesn't mean that since you avoided the fight, you're going to win. So, if your strategy is very bad, there's a reason because of which nobody followed you. In some games, that might be going for points too early. Like I have seen some players trying to go for coins for points very early in a game and be punished for that. In Great Western Trail, that might be going for cows early on, for a lot of cows with just one or two cowboys. I think you are probably going to be stuck because you were not able to get heads, which are good later on. So there are like some tier 3 strategies, like going 0 heads and not having a plan for trashing your whole deck, which is like a completely different strategy. But if you're following a tier 3 strategy, which used to be trashing in the first edition of Great Western Trail, you're not going to win even though you are not fighting on the same axis of your opponents. And sometimes there's only one strategy. Again, Agricola doesn't really have only one strategy, but you need to grow. And if you think you found some very weird plan that doesn't involve growing, I think I don't think you're going to win most of the time. Or like if you try to go with not paying food at the end of the round, when there's the harvest, that's also not going to work. It's not just one strategy, but it's just one main way to approach the game. Again, there are some exceptions most of the time, but in some games there's one main strategy and you should follow it. And the last point is if you were good, you did your own job in the beginning of the game while the other guys were fighting for something else, and now you're in a good position, you're going to be a target in the mid-late game. Depending on the game, some games have high interaction, some game have like not so high interaction, so it depends a lot. But basically, if the other players they finish their fighting, they're settled in some positions, and they see you miles ahead of them because you skewed the fight and you're following still a good plan, you're going to be a target. Again, it matters in some game more than in other games, but it might be pretty bad in some of these games. Like in Barrage, I was able to position myself one time in a very good position thanks to a very strong high dam in one spot, and the other guys actually went out of their hands to damage me, and I ended up being in the second place. So it can happen. It's not that common, I would say, but it's something to keep in mind if you're trying to go for the minority. That's it for today. Um, 10 minutes, that should be it. See you next time. Mario's out. Bye bye.